Hi everybody. Welcome to Info 504, Week 3. This week we are going to be discussing the Information Lifecycle Model, which is a theoretical framework that helps us understand how an organization relates to the information that it produces and uses. This is actually a great starting point for us in developing our own systematic approach to information management. And we're going to refer back to the lifecycle model several times again during the rest of this course. Now, when we talk about the lifecycle model, what we really mean is a high-level overview of how any organization relates to the information that it produces and uses. By organization, I mean any group of people who are dedicated to producing and managing information. So an organization in this context could be an academic research lab, it could be a public or a private sector office environment, it could be a library, it could be another type of information managing organization. The concept of the life cycle implies that there's a starting point where information is produced or collected and it enters the organization, and that there's also an ending point where the information has lost its value to the organization and is then disposed of in some manner. Now, the process of applying a life cycle model to a real-world scenario is called Information Lifecycle Management, or ILM. You'll see various definitions for ILM in your readings and in other literature about information management. And the definition really depends on your perspective to information management. So, for example, the IT manager in an organization is going to think of ILM as how they maintain servers and disk storage and network connectivity. To the people in an organization who manage information content and organize it and make it accessible to people, ILM is going to mean something very different. So we need to keep a broad idea that ILM is simply applying a life cycle model to a real-world scenario, and we won't focus too much on the specific definitions that are used by each perspective at this time. The life cycle concept originated in the computer industry and was initially designed as a way to document how information is gathered in order to manage a large-scale information system. And that's the technical, IT-oriented version of what life cycle management is. The other major influence on modern life cycle model theory was developed in the early 1980s by the manufacturing industry, specifically the auto industry, in what now is called product life cycle management, in which a manufacturing organization defines how its products are conceived of, tested, produced, and distributed to its customers. So both of these private sector industry niches contributed to the development of the contemporary life cycle model. Now, the life cycle model has several specific types of characteristics. As I think I mentioned, it is a conceptual model, so it's an idea-oriented model that is designed to abstract how information flows through an organization and give you the highest level view of how an organization relates to its information. It's supposed to be objective and descriptive also, so it shows relationships between the major stages in the lifespan of information from its beginning point to its end point. It's modular in that it defines each stage as an identifiable unit. It's scalable in that it can be used to describe very small information management processes, as one person might be responsible for in a large organization, and it can also be scaled very large to show how a whole organization relates to the information it uses. And it's very adaptable. It's a generic theory of modeling that is used for both many different kinds of subject disciplines, but also many different roles in information management within each subject discipline. Now, the major point in understanding the life cycle model process is that we want to understand how an organization values its information. And when an organization either collects information or creates it, it has an initial kind of value to that organization that's very intense, and that sort of value changes over time, and it becomes less intense to where information by the end of its life doesn't have any value, or at least not that's perceived to that organization that produced it. The concept of perceived value is very important to us. Perceived value is, we use that term because the information by itself has no intrinsic value of its own. It's what our perception of how important that information is to us. Once we've assimilated information and we understand it, and that information then becomes part of other information we produce, the perceived value that we have for the original information is substantially lowered. An example of this might be when we look at the field of biology. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, when it was first published, had a high level of value to that scientific discipline, and it maintains a certain type of high-level value today, but it's more of a historical value. And actually, a contemporary researcher who's an evolutionary biologist probably doesn't view Origin of Species as being extremely valuable as a work of scholarship to their current research work as somebody who did in the mid-19th century. Now, there are different types of value that can be placed on information. The three major types that we can talk about easily are financial, operational, or intrinsic. Now, financial value is expressed through the life cycle model as a cost analysis. How much does it cost in an organization to produce and manage information? Its operational value is how is that information valuable in helping that organization perform its major functions. And then once information becomes outdated and is no longer seen of great financial or operational value, it does retain a sort of historical value because it shows us, as a piece of documentation, what came before the information that we have currently. So it takes on an intrinsic value. And intrinsic value is important for a number of different reasons in an organization. It can have a legal value in that historical records are important for companies and organizations to keep to document their history. It can have an educational value that makes it important for somebody who is being trained in the organization to know what information was originally produced before the current information that you're working with. And when the value of information changes within an organizational context, we call that value transformation. And that can mean that information either loses part of its value, that value changes, or that value increases to the organization. Now, as I mentioned previously, there are many different perspectives on information management within any given organization. So these are some of the major perspectives that we need to look at today as being important to consider in developing a life cycle model for an organization. Now, conceptual perspective on information is good for planning, taking that high-level view of how information should flow effectively through an organization. When we make determinations that only certain people should have access to information, or that we should only retain information for a certain period of time before we delete it, and that's a policy perspective on information management. When we talk about how effectively our procedures are that help us create and develop information and distribute it, that's called a process perspective, and which is most closely connected to the idea of a specific set of workflows or procedures that are undertaken by people in the organization who are actively managing the information. We also need to take a perspective on what kind of physical form information takes. The format is important in that we have different technical and access requirements to it. And we need to make sure when we create information, for example, we're creating it in all the right forms for the people who need to use it. And if we're only creating it in a single form at the beginning, then we may have to consider converting it later on in order to distribute it properly. Modern and certainly any digital information management has to deal with a system that is designed to help process or store electronic information. So taking a systems design perspective on information management is important. It can be important so that we can see within an information flow that there might be areas where we could automate manual processes that are taking a lot of time. It can also be used to determine what user features are needed to be added to an information system to make it work more effectively for its end users. And then certainly from a hardware and software perspective, we need to consider what kind of really hard basic computing resources are needed in order to manage our information. Do we need a lot of online storage, or could we have some nearline, what's called nearline storage, that might be on tape or on stored in a remote system? Do we need specific processes to archive our information for disaster recovery? Do we need specific types of servers in order to run the software that manages the information? So that's a technical perspective on the information lifecycle. Let's move on now to actually examining what the lifecycle looks like. And to do this, we're going to use a basic theoretical model that was developed by the British Joint Information Systems Committee, or JISC. And this is from your major reading for this week. But the JISC information lifecycle is extremely simple and easy to adapt, and it's made that way in order to be as adaptable to different kinds of information management scenarios as possible. So the JISC lifecycle has 4 primary steps to it, and we're going to examine each of these in some detail right now. The first step is called creation, but creation includes not just creation of information from scratch, but it can also include the discovery of information as in a research data management environment, the accumulation or bringing together of existing information as in a library environment. But it's the point where information enters into the organization in order to be used. Now, when we are designing our creation stage of the information lifespan, we need to consider a couple of different issues. So, are the people who are creating or gathering information, do they have the proper qualifications, and are they properly trained to be able to perform that function? Are we capturing or creating information in the proper forms, either physical or digital forms? Is the content, is the actual data that we're collecting and providing in this stage, is that appropriate to the purpose that we need the information for? And is it as extensive or exhaustive as we need it to be? And then finally, all information needs some sort of summarization or documentation so that people can search and retrieve it, people who need to use the information. So are we adequately documenting the information to enable its active use and retrieval? The second stage in the life cycle is called active use, and this is the most formative period during the information lifespan. This is where information is being modified its most, and it's being updated and kept current the most, and it's also got the most perceived value to the organization at this stage. And when we move to the active use stage of the information lifespan, we need to consider whether the actively used information is properly accessible. And I use the term accessibility here not in terms of handicapped users, although it does include that, but in terms of, is the information accessible to everybody who needs to use it in the format that they need to use it in? Now, active information may not be in its final form. It may be a draft, it may be an early version of a final product, like a research paper, for example. So each piece of information that we're going to track through the lifespan needs to have a status. We need to know what status it's at, what point in its formulative development it's in. We also need to have specific rules for modifying it. And we also need a protocol for determining who can have access to modify the information at what time. Sometimes that's called a chain of custody. Also, we need to know if we need to change the format of the information. We need to know whether we have the most effective way of delivering it and distributing it to the users who need it. So how fast can we get our users the information in the format that they need to be able to use it in? And then so the last thing, very important in this stage, is we need to begin tracking how the information is used. That's usually in two parts. We want to track how often people search for and hit this information, and how often they actually use it after they found it. This is important for the other two stages in the information lifespan. Now, the longest period of life for an element of information within an organization is the semi-active use stage. And that's because there's a phenomena that's demonstrated in the chart below that shows that information is generally most used when it's initially created, and then it quickly starts to become outdated. And unless it's kept current by continual updating, it will move into the semi-active use phase, where its value starts to decrease sharply over time. We see this often in the field of bibliometrics, which measures how scholarly communications are used in academia and research. And when a new article on a specific subject matter is first published, say in a scholarly journal, Well, generally, the whole profession that uses that information scrambles to assimilate that article, and then once they've assimilated it, the value of that article is generally diminished quite a bit. And over time, as new information is produced that supersedes that article, that value and the use of that article are going to decline into where they actually rarely get used at all over a long period of time. We know that when you write a research paper, you're always trying to look for articles that were published within the last few years, so that you're making sure that you get the most recent perspectives on the information. Unless you're writing a historical article, it's usually not preferred to try to cite sources from 200 or 300 years ago. So during the semi-active use period, we see the perceived value of any piece of information diminish significantly over time. As I mentioned, rapid decrease in perceived value of information at this stage. Usage statistics will continue to go down. People will continue, for a semi-active use phase of a piece of information's life, users will continue to find the information, but they'll use it far less often. And at this point, when the value of the information starts to diminish, we'll see little or no modification or attempt to update the information, which helps speed its demise. And another good example of this phenomena of diminishing returns on any piece of information is that, when you're surfing the web, either for research purposes or for personal purposes, you are going to come across websites that are still live, but you'll notice that they aren't being updated regularly. And it might have been some time since the content on that website is updated. Those are rarely the sites that you want to go to for most current information. So you'll find them when you Google a particular topic, but you won't use them. You'll opt for more current sites. The last stage in this information model is the final outcome stage. And that's where the organization makes the final determination on whether there is some residual value to the information or whether it needs to be purged from the life cycle completely. And this is another occurrence of value transformation. If we recycle information, meaning that we're going to update it, reformat it, or incorporate it into other new information, then we can retain some of its original value, and that gets folded back into the creation process and continues to move within the life cycle and lifespan. If we decide that the information has absolutely no value at all, then it's purged by deleting it, by archiving it permanently in some form that is probably difficult to get it back from, like if we might archive a collection of digital information onto digital tape that then gets put on a shelf and gathers dust. The other kind of transformation is that the information takes on a new kind of value and then moves into a different life cycle system. So, for example, historical information about a company, while the records may not have any use for the company operationally today, they may need to move that information off to an archive or a records management facility so that it can be maintained for legal reasons. And there's legal requirements to keep information for a certain period of time. And it may just want to keep the information for intrinsic reasons, to be able to document the company's history. So those are the three major outcomes of the final stage of the lifespan of information. It either re-enters the life cycle, it becomes extinct, or it moves into a different life cycle system. Now, if we move from the general JISC life cycle design, let's look at a couple of more specific, customized life cycles that are designed for specific information management disciplines. This one is still simple in its basic structure, but it's the life cycle that was designed, developed by the American Records Management Association to show how information that needs to be retained for long-term archiving is handled. And again, this is just one example of many of how a life cycle can be customized for a specific use. Rather than go into each of these stages, let's move on and look at another example. This is a really great example of a fully developed life cycle that has specific customized elements that have been included for a particular information management environment. And again, this is more of a records management type of life cycle, but you can see that we've got added to the creation phase, we have an organization phase and a use and dissemination phase. And at the end of the life cycle, we have an evaluation stage where we take a look at the information and see whether it can be folded back into the current life cycle or we can simply dispose of it finally. So although I've alluded to them, let's cover really quickly the practical applications for information lifecycle modeling and management. Certainly, taking the conceptual perspective, we can use the lifecycle model to help plan new services where they didn't exist before and track how that the new service should relate to other information management processes within an organization. If we're going to take a process or analytical perspective, we can improve existing workflows and processes and help improve their effectiveness to the organization. We can help with training efforts for staff by documenting how information flows through the organization. And then we can use the information from the lifecycle model to help develop information systems and information technology requirements for an organization in terms of developing software and systems that will manage the information directly or developing requirements for hardware and software that we need to help our management functions. One last example here. This is our research data management life cycle. It's one that's commonly used in the academic world for describing the flow of data and information through the research process. And again, we're not going to go into each individual stage in the life cycle here today, but we are going to return to this particular life cycle model and look at it in much more depth in the coming weeks. So it's just a little sign of things to come. I kept the lecture short this week because we have a short week because of Labor Day holiday. I did want to mention a couple things about the assigned readings. to give you some context here. Your major reading for the week, as I think I mentioned, is the Joint Information Systems Committee publication, Managing the Information Lifecycle Info Kit. That will cover the JISC lifecycle model that we just talked some about in more detail. And really, you need to concentrate just on pages 1 through 24 of that document. It has a total of 60 pages. After page 24, the info kit moves on to show how the lifecycle management process can be used for managing email and I believe also managing records. I would like you to take a look at the back section of the document just to familiarize yourself with it, but you really need to study pages 1 through 24. The second article is entitled Management of the Lifecycle of Digital Library Materials. It actually, Ms. Deegan does an excellent job of showing how digital collections can be developed in a way that can be used for many different types of information organizations. So the model that she talks about can easily be extrapolated out of the library environment and into another kind of digital information management environment. Now, digital curation is mostly involved with research data management, which we will cover again later in the course. This web page here, however, goes over probably the most complicated lifecycle model in existence for data management, and it's an excellent contrast to the more simple models that we've covered in this lecture. So I want you to in particular take a look at the lifecycle model diagram that the Digital Curation Center has developed. That's another British agency that has done quite a bit of groundwork in helping to advance the theory and practice of lifecycle management. The Tony Fisher article is a really nice, simple introduction to implementing data management lifecycle in a business or government type of organizational context. And then finally, since our discussion of information technology starts next week, I wanted to end with a more IT-oriented article. This is a poster presentation that summarizes how lifecycle management can be applied to information technology management. And it's done in a nice readable way that's not too overly technical, and it will be a nice segue from lifecycle modeling into information technology next week. And lastly, let's just do a review of this week's assignments. The overview page has detailed information about all of the assignments. We're done with the lecture now. We've gone over the readings. I did include one optional reading about the development of the information management research area, which is just an interesting article that you should take a look at after you get the major assignments done. It's quite useful. The major assignment this week is the custom lifecycle development assignment, which is due September 8th. Detailed instructions are on the overview page, but basically I want you to take an information management scenario that you have direct knowledge of and develop a full formal information lifecycle model for it and document it thoroughly. And then the tools and methods exercise for this week is to use a flowchart application of your choice to develop a graphical diagram of your lifecycle model that you developed for the main assignment. I gave you two open source free alternatives for flowchart applications on the overview page. You're welcome to use your own preferred flowchart application. Mine is Microsoft Visio, but you can use any that you're comfortable with that will actually generate a nice flowchart for you. And then that's due by September 9th. And then once you've posted your 2 major assignments, make sure you reply to at least 3 of your classmates' assignments and post those replies by September 11th. Now, have a great week, and let me know, let Lori know if you have questions or comments. And other than that, we'll talk to you next time around. Bye.